discussion of phenomenology is fundamentally linked to the discussion of the ego as a subjective pool of the relationship in which the world finds its meaning as an intentional object. The importance of such a relationship is such that we can claim without fear of error that everything we know today today as a phenomenology is fundamentally related to it. In short, but more technically, the ego as a subjective pool of an intentional being towards the world, which is fundamentally intervened in its surrounding world, is the starting point of any form of phenomenological study. In this context, it is in this context that the content of the ego and the content of his or her surrounding world is constituted phenomenologically. If you share with me what we have brought so far, you will acknowledge that the discussion of the various elements of the surrounding world can be of particular importance in phenomenological studies. In phenomenologies influenced by Edmund Husserl's transcendental phenomenology, the surrounding world as a whole is made up of intentional objects, the ego of others, and of course non-human animals. In today's talk, Professor Danielle Meijer will address the issue related to the various elements that make up the surrounding world. Professor Meijer will focus on non-human animals and explains her attitude on how we may phenomenologically approach the topic. Danielle Meijer is an adjunct professor in philosophy at DePaul University. Danielle also teaches philosophy at the Stateville Maximum Security Prison in Juliet as a voluntary. She teaches courses in social justice, feminism, and political theory, using phenomenology as the foundation for her political and ethical approach to these issues. In addition to her work as a professor, Danielle teaches and performs several dance styles including belly dance, Middle Eastern dance, South Indian classical dance, Javanese dance, Balinese dance, Argentine tango, hula, and flamenco. She is currently writing a book on youth rights and liberation and has forthcoming article on the subject in the Iranian Yearbook of Phenomenology. The talk that she will be giving for this program is inspired in part by a paper by the same name published in Popular Culture Review, February 22. Daniel, we are ready to just listen to you, and it's your time now to talk.
All right. Thank you so much, Hamid, and thank you for the Iranian Center for Phenomenology. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I wanted to sort of preface how it will sort of go. And if you've seen H. Peter Steeves, my husband's talk from last month, you will know that he has a fairly unusual way of interpreting phenomenology. So if you are a phenomenologist, some of the ways in which I interpret phenomenology might be new to you, and that's okay. So the good news is that if you are not a phenomenologist, you will be able to understand everything that I'm talking about, because I'm not going to use any special terminology, and I'm not going to assume that everyone knows the history of phenomenology. But sort of the bad news is that if you are a phenomenologist, again, some of the ideas or the particular ways in which I interpret phenomenology, specifically through the tradition of Edmund Husserl, might be considered a little strange or unusual. But again, if you've been here for Peter's talk, you'll already have some idea of how it's going to go. But again, everything I'm going to say is without assuming that you have prior knowledge of the topic itself. I also want to try to talk for only an hour or less so that we have a lot of time for questions and to allow you to sort of control where the discussion goes. So before I get into talking specifically about how the non-human. And I'm going to be talking both about animals as well as plants. So not just animal life, but how plant life might be considered moral members of our communities. But before we get into that and how that works phenomenologically, I wanted to talk about how does phenomenology, specifically H. Peter Steeves' version of phenomenology, as he explains it in his first book. There's a special term that we use for his philosophy, and it's called anarchic phenomenological communitarianism. So APC for short, so I will be using that shortened term, APC, anarchic phenomenological communitarianism. So that's the perspective that I'm bringing. It's not just phenomenology in general. It has this political and ethical sort of extra aspect to it. So I wanted to talk about how we approach human ontology. What does it mean to be a self in the world? And how does phenomenology allow us to understand that the self is not isolated? So in Western philosophy, especially in my country, our politics and ethics is grounded in liberal philosophy. So Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and John Locke. So those are sort of the founding thinkers that have influenced my country and certainly the Western world or Europe. And in that tradition, the idea or concept of the self ontologically is the idea that we're isolated, we're selfish, we're isolated, and we're equal. I think I said isolated twice. So we're isolated, selfish, rational, and equal. So the idea that yes, we can have connections with other people, other human beings, socially or psychologically. We can be influenced by others on that level. But ontologically, when we're talking about what it means to be human, liberal thinkers believe that we are fundamentally isolated from one another, meaning what it means to be me has nothing to do with who you are, that I'm not informed ontologically by your presence. That again, socially or culturally, I can be influenced by others, but not at this fundamental level. And phenomenology really shows us a very different way of thinking. So as a thought experiment, try to imagine how you explain yourself to others. So if we met and we introduced ourselves to each other, what are the things that we might say to one another to help us give each other a sense of who we are? So for me, Danielle, I would tell you that I'm an identical twin because that is a very important part of my identity. I'm married to a specific person, Peter, and that's also really important to me. Right? I live in America. I'm a dancer. I'm a professor. I like to read. I like to watch movies. English is my first and only language, unfortunately. And so as I'm describing myself, what I'm doing is describing my roles and relationships in the world. I'm not describing a list of abstract qualities or characteristics that are somehow divorced or separate from the rest of the publicity of the world. So what does that mean? It means that I cannot describe or explain myself in any way at any time that would be purely about me in isolation, that everything about me is about my roles and relationships with others in the world, and not just humans, but animals, plants, and even the non-human, but we'll get to that in a second. So who I am, what makes me a unique self in the world is the collection of the unique ways in which I interact with others. So the great thing about phenomenology, I think, is that you don't have to take anybody's word for it in terms of accepting the veracity or truth of the claims, that you can do this yourself. That's what phenomenology is all about, right? Is really thinking about our experiences of being in the world, of what does it mean to be in existence on planet Earth as human beings. So just do it yourself. If you are skeptical that we are not isolated, but rather in phenomenology, we call it intersubjectivity. We're intersubjective. So our subject selves, our subjecthood, is connected with others. So it means that, if I use my hands here, in liberalism, how they conceptualize the self is the idea that there's me, this fist represents me, and there's you. And there's no ontological connection between me or you. We are isolated beings on this earth. In Eastern religions and philosophies, such as Buddhism, there's an idea that the ego is a kind of illusion, that the self is not really real if we're thinking about how true reality operates. So liberalism, there's you and there's me. There's no connection ontologically. In Buddhism and many other Eastern traditions, we are all one. So me and you are the exact same in reality. In APC, we're intersubjective, meaning I'm a distinct person. I am not you and you are not me. Myself is a very particular thing in the world. But I cannot describe or explain myself as an ontological being, and I cannot describe or explain my experiences of the world. What does it mean to be Danielle as a conscious being on planet Earth, without describing my roles and relationships to specific, particular others in my community? So if I take my relationship with my twin, for example, this is me, this is my twin, right? So we're distinct people, but I can't conceptualize who I am fully without thinking about my connection to my sister. So we're distinct, but we're connected. That's sort of the APC way of thinking about things. So I have a little, I have some little handouts to explain this. So if we think about it in terms of Edmund Husserl's conception of ontology, he uses this concept of an horizon, which is like a flat line. Hope people can see that. Let me move my cursor so I can everybody see what that is. I can email this to people as well if it's not 100% clear. So for Husserl, this is the horizon, and you can think about this as the horizon of your ontological self. And the X's on the piece of paper are the different roles and relationships that you have in the world. So for me, I would say one X is talking about the fact that I'm a daughter to two very specific people in the world. Another X could be my marriage to my husband. Another X could be the fact that I'm an identical twin to Maurice Meyer, specific person in the world. Another X could be, right, that I'm a professor, that I'm a dancer, etc., etc., etc. So all the X's, according to Husserl, are fleshing out my horizon of being, myself, ontologically. That in order to phenomenologically understand my position in the world and who I am on a fundamental level, I'm just thinking about my roles and relationships. How do people perceive me in the world and in my society? How do I perceive myself because of my relationships, right? So think about how other people perceive you and how you perceive yourself, that we're influenced by the perceptions of others. So an example would be if I had an abusive childhood, which I didn't, but to imagine if that were to be the truth, and every day my parents would say, you're stupid, you're ugly, you're worthless, you won't get anywhere in life. That will influence how I see myself in a profound way, that it will affect my perspective on my ontology of who I am. If I have a different way, like in my real life, where my parents were very loving, I'm going to have a very different conception of the self. So in terms of our consciousness, we are fundamentally influenced by our culture, our particular families, the politics and ethics that are in our culture and society. And those are things that I can't choose or control fundamentally. I can't choose who my parents are. I can't choose what cultures I grow up in. I don't choose the languages that I learn as an infant that shape my consciousness. So my point is that when we think about who we are as people, our consciousness itself is co-constituted. just like this little example of intersubjectivity, co-consciousness is the same thing. It's another way of talking about intersubjectivity. That our very consciousness at a foundational level, says Husserl in the Cartesian Meditations, the fifth meditation, he says, as our consciousnesses are being formed, they are formed with others. So I can't even be a person at all without others. Someone says they don't have my voice. How am I sounding now? Can people hear me?
Yeah, we
Okay.
can hear you.
I apologize. I just saw somebody who said that they couldn't hear.
Yeah.
Technology, right? So if you think about like an infant, a human infant, their consciousness is created by the particular culture that they grow up in, right? So the languages that they're learning, the particular people that are raising them, that's necessary and crucial. The way that we are even up and running on a very foundational level. And a good example of this is feral children. So human children that were abandoned by their families and left in the wild and were raised by animals. So we do have some examples of this. And examples of infant humans who did not have any interaction with other humans. And what happens to these feral children is that they don't learn how to be human. That they, in a very real ontological sense, they are not human. So yes, their DNA is human, but their culture is not human. Their way of thinking is not human. So there's a very famous example of this, Amala and Kamala, twins in India, who were raised by wolves. And their being, when they were discovered by humans, they sort of acted like wolves. They didn't have human language. They didn't think like humans. And so that's just a good example, I think, of understanding how important it is in terms of our consciousness, our intersubjectivity, who the specific people in our culture and society are, how they shape us on a foundational level. So going back to this little picture of the horizon, the more I try to investigate who I am and try to figure out, well, who is Danielle Meijer? And each X is representing a particular role or relationship in my life. What happens is that you get something that looks like this. And this is where Peter, my husband, sort of adds on to Husserl's theory. So as I start to, quote unquote, flesh out my horizon, I'm understanding more and more who I am. What I start to understand is that most of my roles and relationships, my experiences of the world, tend to cluster in the center. And it creates a kind of bell curve, as you can see. And I don't know if you can see very specifically, but if you notice on the very ends of this parabolic curve or bell curve, the horizon, that bell curve that sort of gives shape to my identity, is asymptotic. Asymptotic means that the lines don't ever meet, that there's an infinity. So there's sort of a general way that you're going to experience me, sort of like what we would call my personality. And you would encounter me usually either as a professor, a friend, a dancer, someone who lives in America, et cetera, et cetera. But then you're going to have these sort of outlier experiences in extreme situations where they're going to be kind of unusual. So this is true of any ontology process. So take an inanimate object, for instance. If you think about a water glass, we're going to usually have a set of experiences with a glass that holds liquid. That's pretty normal and everyday. Your everyday use of a glass is going to contain a limited amount of experiences that are going to be very similar to one another, right? So I'm going to either have juice, water, coffee, soda, right? I'm going to be drinking out of this glass. That's how I interact with glasses most of the time. But in terms of the horizon, phenomenologically, if I'm in a war zone, I could use this glass, I could pick it up, and I could throw it at somebody. So now the being of that thing is as a weapon, not as a vessel from which to drink. So that experience of a glass is going to be sort of an outlier. It's going to be on the outside, almost on the edges of that horizon of being. What that suggests is, in terms of Husserlian phenomenology, is that we are infinite. So given infinite time, if we had an infinite amount of time in which to experience things, we would have an infinite number of ways in which to experience not only human beings, but anything that is real and exists in the world, such as inanimate objects, like a water glass. So that's sort of exciting in phenomenology, is that we are bounded as beings. So there is something very specific that it means to be Danielle Meijer. There's something very specific that it means to be you in the world. No one else is like you. You are unique, completely unique. And yet, we are also infinite. So the infinitude of who we are is bounded. Just because I'm infinite does not mean I'm just everything. I'm not you. I can't be you. You can't be me. So there are boundaries to our identities, but it's open-ended. So I can use another graph here to show the ways in which, let's say this is my twin sister and this is me. So we are distinct individuals. There's a lot of things that we don't have in common in terms of our life experience and just our particular ways of being in the world. But if you see here, part of our horizons of being overlap. We have things in common, especially as identical twins. Because we have so much overlap in terms of our identity, people can mistake us for each other because we look like each other. And we also act, if you knew my sister and I, we are very similar. So we're still unique beings, but because we have so much overlap in terms of our identity, we can actually be mistaken. And so in terms of phenomenology and the phenomenology of experience, we can't just take our experiences at face value, that we can be wrong at first glance about how we're interpreting our experiences. And this is going to be important in terms of ethics and politics later on in the talk, because for most of us and most of our cultures, we do not see non-human animals and plants as equal morally or politically to human beings. And we feel like our experiences prove that to us. We have learned from our culture that, humans are supreme, that we're the most important species on the planet. And we can be mistaken about that. So the interesting thing about phenomenology, it's not just merely saying, oh, whatever I experience in the world is true. You have to think critically about it. We have to investigate our experience in a really sophisticated way, because we can be wrong about our experiences. And part of what makes the world difficult to understand sometimes is because our horizons overlap, that we're intersubjective, and that sometimes one thing can look like something else, or that we can have an experience of a self in the world or an object in the world that is at such an outlying place that we don't see the rest of the horizon of that self. So an example would be, if you don't have a lot of experience with cows when they're alive, that your only experience of cowness is as food, you're going to have a very diminished way of thinking about that animal as food, animal as something that I eat. You are suppressing, or you're not aware of the fullness of that being, because you're only having one kind of experience. If we only have a very limited number of experiences of people and of objects, we're not going to understand fully what those beings truly are. We need to have a variety of experience. We need to experience other beings in the world in multiple ways in order to get a truly accurate sense of what that thing is in the world or what that person is in the world. So in phenomenology, again, for those of you who are phenomenologists, this will be, you'll know this already. When asked with the question about being, who is Danielle Meijer? What is Danielle Meijer? What is a water glass? The phenomenological answer to any question of being, of what is the ontological nature of X, X being anything that we want to investigate, the answer always is all the ways in which X can appear to consciousness. So who is Danielle Meijer? All the ways in which I can appear to someone's consciousness. And because, given infinite time, someone can have an infinite amount of different, varied, unique experiences of me, I, as an ontological being, therefore am infinite. That you can never fully know me 100%. I can't know myself 100%. Because as long as I'm alive, there's always opportunities for me to experience myself in new and different ways that I've never experienced before, and opportunities for others to experience me in new and different ways. So this is, to me, very beautiful. In the history of Western philosophy, philosophers tend to want to, up until the 20th century, they want to figure out what things are in the world 100%. This is what the project of the Enlightenment was in Europe. This idea that we want to know what the universe is 100%, no mystery, write everything down, close the book, and then we're done with ontology. Phenomenology is radically different. It's saying you will never know a particular being 100% because there's always the possibility and potential to have new and different experiences and interactions with those things in the world. I think that's a really beautiful thing. The second part and the last part to this about human or any kind of ontology, phenomenologically, is that I am public and not private. And that doesn't just go for me, it goes for all humans, animals, plants, and objects. So anything that exists in the world is public and not private. This is self-evident, right? I'm not having this Skype conversation in my head. I'm out in the world. Even my brain we tend to think of our brains or our consciousness as private because it's inside of our bodies. But that is not true. Our bodies are in the world. Our brains are assimilating information not only like outside, right? So my perceptions are not sort of giving my brain information from the outside world. My brain is in the world. My body is in the world. And all my organs are also inside the world. My body is not private. My brain is not private. My consciousness is not private. You may not know what I'm thinking, and I may not know what you're thinking right now, but that doesn't mean there's an ontological isolation there. Because we talked about co-constituted consciousness, this idea that the thoughts, the kinds of thoughts that you can have are mediated by your culture, your particular history in life, how you grew up, the books that you read, the movies that you watch, the classes that you take, the thoughts that you have when you're thinking at home about the world. All right, so our consciousness is not private, it's public. Even though, yes, of course, psychologically, people can't read minds, but on an ontological level, that doesn't mean we're isolated. So because my ontology, who I am, I'm a public being, and everything in the world is also public, it means that my perception of the world is very limited. I only can see the world through my eyes. You can only see the world through your eyes. This should be humbling to us in the sense that I can never know you 100% because not only are you different from me and I'm not with you every moment of your life, but you have relationships and roles with other people and objects outside of me. That's why I can't know you. It's not because you're isolated. So in liberal theory, that would be proof. Like Hobbes says, well, of course we're isolated because we can never know each other 100%. You can't read my mind. You will never experience life through my eyes. This is true, but only because of our publicity. So our individuality derives not because we're isolated fundamentally on an ontological level. It is precisely because we are public and we are connected with others, but not just one other. So my twin and I are very close. I know her better than anyone else, and she knows me better. But there's still going to be things that we don't share because I'm not her husband, for instance. So that relationship is apart from me. So I can observe it from the outside, but I'm not a part of that relationship, if that makes sense. So our publicity with many other creatures means that we will never be able to flesh out the horizon ontologically of other people 100%. There's going to be a lot of things that I will not be able to perceive of others. One, because of this publicity, that I'm connected and you're connected to many, many things. I don't have complete access or control or perception over the other people and relationships that you have. But it's also this idea that we live in time as creatures, and so we have a past and we have a future. And so the things that I'm not complete as a person because I'm going to have future experiences that I don't even know, I don't have access to. I can't know myself 100% because I will never know exactly how you perceive me, because I perceive myself as a self, but you are perceiving me as an other, which is sort of freaky if you think about it, and weird, and you don't want to think about it too much because it makes you self-conscious. But right now, when I'm talking right now, I'm experiencing this relationship that we're all having, this event that we're having, as me. But all of you have a very different perspective. You're experiencing what is happening right now as yourselves. And each of you are radically unique. So just because I'm the speaker and you're the audience right now, how you are participating and performing as an audience member is individual and distinct from every other audience member, if that makes sense. So what I'm saying again is that our horizons of being are infinite yet bounded. There are distinct, I'm a distinct self in the world. There's very particular ways in which I am existing in the world, and yet I'm open. So I'm bounded. I'm not just everything. You can't just say Danielle's everything else. Danielle's a blade of grass. And yet I'm connected to other things. I'm connected to grass. Part of my ontology is grass ontology. So we're distinct and bounded yet infinite. We are public, not private. We exist in time. So we have a future and a past. And that means that there's a lot of things that are not fully presently present at this moment. So a lot of aspects of who I am are not present right now because a lot of who I am existed in the past and is no longer presently present. And a lot of the things that I will be in the future, right, have not yet happened. So, all right, that's ontology in a very small nutshell for APC phenomenologists. Why does that matter? Why did I spend all this time talking about it when we're supposed to be talking about animals? Because unless we understand what we are ontologically, we can't do politics or ethics. We have to sort of understand our position in the world and what is possible in the world in order to understand how ethics and politics work. So if we are co-constituted in terms of our consciousness on a fundamental level with others, if we are intersubjective and not isolated, then what that means is that our ethics is intersubjective. So ethics for phenomenologists are not private. This is in contrast to liberalism. In liberalism, ethics is something that is privately pursued and conceived. So in America, for instance, we have individual rights. Yes, someone's asking, so are we fundamentally communal beings? Absolutely we are. Sorry, where was I? So ethics, yeah. So in liberalism, liberals believe that rights and ethics is private. So we have individual rights in America because our country, our nation assumes that the good is privately conceptualized. So you can't tell me how to live my life in America. I'm an isolated individual. No one can tell me what to do as long as I'm not hurting other people. So the law of non-interference in liberalism is important because I can't be free. I mean, you can't be free if I'm constantly messing with your life. So as long as I'm not hurting anybody in liberalism, I can do what I want with my life. And even if you think that what I'm doing is harmful to myself or just not quite the right way to do things, as long as I'm not hurting you, you can't tell me what to do. You cannot tell me that my idea of my own good is false. So in liberalism, goods are isolated and goods are independently pursued. We have no communal good. I know that liberal thinkers do talk about like the commonwealth. I mean, Hobbes talks about it, but he's talking about it on a different level than what I'm talking about. And if you're confused about that, or if you want me to explain that more, I can do that in the Q&A at the end. But there is no deep communal good in liberalism, is my point. And there cannot be if the liberal ontology is saying that we are isolated and not intersubjective. So if we're intersubjective, if our consciousnesses are co-constituted, then it just bears, it's sort of self-evident that our ethics is public and not private. So what I have, hold on, let me get a little, sorry. So I'm going to use a physical object because it's easier to understand what I'm saying when I'm using something physical. So let's say that this figurine is the shared good in my community. So right now, your camera is picking up the front of this figurine. I'm looking at the backside. So if we're talking about the communal good, the shared good, my perspective is limited. I cannot see the entire figurine right now. I can only see the back of it. So I'm seeing the tail and the hair and the back of the wings. You're seeing the front. You're seeing the face of this unicorn figure. You're seeing the front legs. So in a community, we have unique perspectives on the shared good. We're all accessing the shared good from different perspectives, and we see slightly different things. In order for me to understand the shared good, I cannot rely on just my perception alone because I don't have the whole story, so to speak. I only have one perspective. So if I'm making a big decision in my life that involves ethics, I have to appeal to my community and say, hey, I'm thinking of doing X, Y, or Z. This is how the good looks to me from my perspective. But what does it look like from your perspective? Because maybe someone is seeing a mistake or a problem or a potential harm that I may commit if I'm only pursuing the good from how I see it. So gathering perspectives from other people in my community helps me better understand the shared good, which is my good. So a lot of people are confused with APC and phenomenology because they believe that, oh, what you're saying is that in a community, I have to ignore my good for the sake of the whole. That's not phenomenology. That's true in a philosophy such as Confucianism, like in China, where there's something called communalism. And in Confucianism, some of the time, the good of the whole outweighs what an individual might want to do. So in Confucianism, for instance, there's a hierarchy in the family system where the oldest male sibling is seen as sort of more important than the other siblings. And so how that older male sibling is going to be allowed to do things is going to be different. They're going to have more power than the younger siblings and the female siblings. The parents have more power over the children. in Confucianism. So yes, in those kinds of cultures that are communal, not communitarian, it's confusing, it's the same base word, but it's a different philosophy. Sometimes I have to ignore my good for the sake of the good of the whole. In APC, we don't compromise. There is no compromise in APC. What we're doing is we're trying to figure out what the good actually is for all of us. So in my marriage, for instance, when there's a disagreement, it's not that I ever think, oh, well, my husband disagrees with me. I'm going to have to give up my own way of thinking about what I want to do for the sake of what he thinks. No, I don't have to compromise, and neither does he. What we're doing is, if we have a disagreement on how we perceive our shared good in that relationship, all relationships, by the way, have their own good, in addition to just the general communal good. What we're trying to do is figure out where our perceptual mistakes lie in our disagreement. Because the good is shared, so there's only one good. If we have a conflict, it means that there's something going wrong in either one of our ways of perceiving, or both of us are wrong about the perception. And so what we do in APC ethics is we just talk it out. When we have a disagreement where certain members of the community see the good differently than I do in a really profound way, we don't suppress other people and say, well, you're wrong. We always have to listen to each other. This is another really interesting thing about APC. There is no majority rule. It has to be unanimous. So the way that we do ethics and politics in APC is anarchic. So there's no government or, hierarchy of power. What we do is, even if just one person out of 1,000 thinks differently, we have to listen to that one person. We have to figure out what's going wrong, and we have to do everything in our power to make sure that that one person who disagrees with everybody else feels comfortable at the end of the day. And we don't stop talking about ethics until unanimity is reached. This, of course, seems impossible, right? This is why liberals, for instance, do not agree with this. They believe in majority rule. John Locke was sort of the founder of majoritarian democracy because they believed people are too different to really agree 100%. But when we look at indigenous communities, like Native American societies, we see that they actually do this. So in many indigenous tribal societies, they are doing a similar kind of thing that phenomenologists are doing, where they believe in unanimity, where everybody comes together to work out political and ethical issues. Why am I talking about this? Because what if we are wrong about who is in and who is not in our community on a moral and political level? Of course, in liberalism and in pretty much every civilization in the world today, we only take into account human consciousness when it comes to ethics and politics. We only see citizenship, for instance, as belonging to human persons. Animals are not citizens of any nation state, and neither are plants, and neither are the non-human, like a mountain. And I wish we can talk about the non-human, because I actually believe that even the non-living, even mountains, might have a moral perspective on the good, but that would take a lot more time for me to explain. So we're just going to talk about living creatures for now. So my thesis is that if we're intersubjective, if the good is shared, then it's not just shared with humans. Because think about it. You don't have to take my word for it. Think about your experience of the world. If you have a pet or any kind of animal in your life that is meaningful to you, your good is tied to that animal. If you are affecting the good or the bad of a particular animal in your life, you have a moral responsibility to that creature. So that's how we figure out who is in our community in APC, is who am I affecting and who is affecting me? Who am I related to? So if my everyday actions are influencing the non-human world, I am morally responsible to that, and I need to figure out a way to understand my community such that I'm respecting those non-human persons. So our communities perhaps may not be limited politically or ethically to the human, because We are not just influenced by humans ethically, politically, or ontologically. So if you grew up with a cat in your household, for instance, that cat influenced your ontology. It influenced your experience of the world. Your relationship with your pets, if you have pets, right? You're having experiences with that animal, and good or bad, and that is shaping your life. All we have in our life are our experiences. So whomever we are in contact with, those beings are influencing us, right? If I am affecting the good or the bad of a non-human creature, I'm morally responsible, and I have to take that moral responsibility just as seriously as my moral responsibility to human persons. How do I prove that? So I'm going to use two examples to sort of prove why the non-human matters morally. The first example is what I call like the race to moral supremacy. So we're going to do a little thought experiment. And what I want you to imagine, or if you have something to write on, is we're going to compare 4 different categories of species in terms of their moral worth. So I'm going to define sort of moral goodness in the following way. I want you to think about which species that we're going to discuss is the most moral based on how that species acts in their everyday life in a way that does the least harm to itself and others. So if it's confusing, I'll break it down. One is human. So that's one species that we're going to talk about. And let's talk about a specific human, because not all humans in all societies act the same way. So I'm going to use myself as an example. You use you as an example. So me, Danielle, the human, what do I do just by being alive? So not consciously thinking. I'm not trying to be a good person. I'm not trying to be a bad person. I'm only going to think about my everyday actions just by existing in America as a middle-class person. What is my impact on the world? Versus a lion, an earthworm, and a tree. So those are the 4 categories: a human, a civilized human, a lion, an earthworm, and a tree. What are the things that I do as a human? So let's talk about humans first. So in my everyday life, I affect others in predominantly negative ways. Just by living my everyday middle-class American life, I create enormous amounts of trash, most of which is not biodegradable. So I pollute my environment. I pollute the water that is around me. I pollute the air by driving a car, by using certain technologies. I throw a lot of trash again away that goes into landfills and poisons the land, the water, the air, that affects both humans and non-humans. The kinds of food that I personally eat is very processed and manufactured, and it requires a lot of energy and waste to produce. I use a lot of technologies in my everyday life that when you create those technologies, such as computer technologies, it creates a lot of toxins for the people who are making those technologies in factories because of plastics. Of course, when I throw away those technologies, they end up in landfills. So my point is that just by being alive and I'm not trying to do these things. That's the key, is that I'm not trying to harm people. When I wake up every day, my thought is not, oh gosh, what can I do today that harms others? I don't try to do that, but that's the byproduct of just living the life that I do. And I think that's problematic. The only one good thing, I do this in my classes, by the way, that I do just by being alive, is that I exhale carbon dioxide, and that's good for trees. So, all right, that's a plus for me. But I can't really think of much else that is inherently good. Of course, you might think, okay, but Danielle, how do you treat other human beings? You know, what about your moral choices? Like, oh, you're a teacher, maybe you're helping people learn. stuff. Okay, but that's extra. That's me going out of my way to try to do good. Even if I were to include those sorts of things in this thought experiment, the overall harm to planet Earth overwhelms any good that I do for an individual human or, family member, or even a pet if I had a pet. So yes, I do perhaps good things in the world by trying to be a good and nice person. But if I'm comparing all the things that I do to affect the planet at large, it far outweighs the good things, unfortunately. So I think I get a bad grade in terms of, as a being in the world, am I mostly good or mostly bad in terms of the perspective of non-human others and even many human others, because a lot of the products that I consume are created by slave labor in other countries. And if I'm polluting my environment, that's going to affect other humans, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think I do very well. If we think about lions, what do lions do just by being lions, right? So the lion is not reading Aristotle to try to figure out how to do ethics, right? The lion is just being a lion without thinking. Well, lions, by eating the animals that they do, they can cull the herd. So they're keeping populations of certain species within an acceptable, sustainable, ecological limit. So that's sort of good, although it's not good for the individual animals. So it's good for perhaps a species, like it's good for the gazelle species to not overpopulate, but the individual gazelles that the lion is eating, not good for them. So it's sort of a half good, half bad thing, morally. Their feces can help nourish the earth, right, to create good soil. So there's that. A lion can be kind to other lions that the lion knows, all right? Those are sort of the only things I can think of that are positive. The negatives are, of course, is that they're apex predators. They are killers. They're very similar to humans in that respect. So they do a lot of damage to individual creatures by their diet, which is sort of a negative. Let's talk about earthworms. We tend to privilege mammals such as lions. So if we're going to think about being generous to non-humans, we tend to be generous to mammals first, to the non-human animals that are most like us. So most of us feel more sad when a lion is harmed than when an earthworm is killed, right? We care more about mammals because they have brains, they can have emotions like we do, they look more like us. Bugs don't look like us. They don't have much of a consciousness, as much as we can understand that. They don't look like us. They seem to be poor in world in a Heideggerian sense. Although for Heidegger, all animals, non-human animals, are poor in world, but I digress. So earthworms are not on our minds morally very much for most humans. But what do earthworms do every day of their life without thinking? Just by being an earthworm, what does an earthworm do? Just by being an earthworm makes the soil good. Just by doing their thing, they are creating the soil that all life depends upon in order to exist. It is pretty profound. If all the earthworms were to die, all species would be greatly endangered. We need earthworms, all of us on planet Earth, in order to really thrive. If lions were to cease to exist, it may create overpopulation for some species, although I think other things could make up for that. So that might be difficult. So I think lions do have importance. If I died, other than my friends and family who would be sad, the earth itself would be just fine without me. In fact, it would thrive without me. That's the heartbreaking thing. I am not necessary to other living creatures other than my loved ones. So let's take a non-animal example, a tree. So most species of trees are incredibly nonviolent. What do trees eat? They eat the sun and they take nutrients from the soil. But the really fascinating thing about trees is that as they are taking certain nutrients from the soil to nourish themselves, they actually put more nutrients back in. So they give back more than what they take, is what I'm saying. They're completely nonviolent in terms of maintaining their existence. So they don't kill to eat anything. If it's a fruit-bearing tree or a nut-bearing tree, they provide food for other species. If it is a leafy kind of tree, on a hot day, you can seek shade underneath a tree. Many trees are home to many species, many other animals, squirrels and birds and bugs. Certain kinds of trees can give us medicine, such as aspirin. Aspirin was originally, taken from trees. Trees can help purify waterways. If a tree lives nearby a stream, for instance, the roots actually help to purify the water. Trees, of course, create oxygen. Oxygen was not the Earth's first atmosphere. So for a long time in Earth's history, we did not have an oxygen-rich atmosphere. So all of life now, presently on planet Earth, depends on oxygen, to live. Without trees, we wouldn't be able to do that. If all the trees on planet Earth were to die, that would be a huge problem for all of us. So again, my point with this thought experiment is to figure out if we want to say humans are morally supreme to all other creatures, what is our empirical evidence of that? Why should I care about humans above and beyond all other creatures if it doesn't seem like at least civilized humans do a lot of good for other species? Me personally, I think the tree sort of wins this race. I think the tree is the closest we have to a truly saint-like being. In fact, for those of you that have spiritual mentors or even just people that you look up to, if you think about the Prophet Muhammad, if you think about Jesus Christ, if you think about Gandhi, Buddha, we appreciate these people and look up to these people because why? Because they act in ways that most humans don't. They're very moral and they are very compassionate. The thing about that is that trees have a lot more in common with our spiritual leaders than most everyday humans, such that if I really want to see the face of God, the face of a spiritual leader, I can look to a tree and see that face of a spiritual being, of someone who's truly moral. As a human being, I can learn so much from the non-human. If I look at the earthworm, I can learn how to be a better human by adopting some of the attitudes and principles of the earthworm. If I look at a tree and think about how a tree exists in the world, I can become a better human being. Jesus has more in common with trees than I think that he does with me. And I think that's a profound thing to perhaps conceptualize. Before I move on, I do want to mention that I don't believe in what I just said when it comes to hierarchy. I don't actually think that trees are worth more morally than humans, because this is the one and only time I'm going to agree with Kant here. I believe that people are a means to an end. I mean, a means to themselves, not a means to an end, right? That our moral worth has nothing to do with what use value we have to others. So let's take a human being who might be so severely mentally handicapped and physically handicapped that they can't really take care of themselves. Does that mean that those humans matter less morally than humans who are able-bodied that could do more for others? No. I believe that all humans matter equally in that sense, that I can't say, well, this person is doing more for each other than this other person, so I'm going to care more about that person morally. Absolutely not. So the reason why I'm using this example is because most people play the game of hierarchy. Most civilized humans are all about who matters the most, who's the most supreme species, humans. And I'm going to say, even if we want to play that game, which I don't think we need to play, humans lose. But we don't have to play this game. So again, I'm not saying that truly that trees matter more in my community. I do think that they perhaps are more moral in terms of their actions than me, but I wouldn't say that they are worth more necessarily, if that makes sense. If anybody's confused in the Q&A week, I can go back to that. So the other thing that I want to give as an example in terms of why animals might and plants, why they might matter more morally than we often think, is taken from this book. And I know that you're seeing it reversed. So it's a long title, and the title is The Case Against Humans by the Animals Before the King of the Jinn. And it is an Arabic text, but I'm not talking about it because I'm addressing an Iranian audience. So this is a book that I teach every year. I teach this book every year in my classes when I talk about animal rights. It is one of my favorite books of all time. So I talk about it no matter who my audience is. And the book, I don't know how that book is it's relatively unknown in America. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it or how common it is. I understand that it's not considered a holy text. So it's not something that I think most Muslims would see as true in a spiritual sense. But why I bring it up is because it was written by the Brethren of Purity, which was a secret group of Muslims. We don't actually know when exactly they lived. We're thinking the 12th to the 13th or 14th centuries. So this book was written a few hundred years ago. And the book is about the animals, like many species of animals, feeling like humans have mistreated them. And so they bring a court case against humans, and they go to the jinn, because the jinn, not being humans or animals, are sort of like a impartial jurors. And they try to explain that the exact name is The Case of the Animals versus Man Before the King of the Jinn. I have a PDF of the entire book. If you want it, I'll send it to Hamid in English, but it's free online. So I will send that information if you're interested. It's it's a beautiful book. I really can't say enough wonderful things about it. But again, what the animals are saying, their thesis in this book, is that humans are misinterpreting Holy Scripture when it comes to what the Quran says about how to treat animals. So the entire book is taking selections from the Quran, and the humans start and they say, well, we think that God is telling us to treat animals in this way. And then the animals reply, disagreeing with the humans, and they're saying, no, you are misinterpreting the will of Allah. So I'll just give you a few examples of what the debates are. So the first, and the way that they open up, is that the humans are going to say, look, animals were created to be our slaves, and the Quran supports this. The Quran actually says humans are supreme. So this is what the humans say, and this is what the animals will reply to. There is evidence, Your Majesty is the jinn, that we humans are the masters of animals, and they are slaves. We buy and sell them. We feed and water the animals. We clothe and shelter them. We protect them from predators. When they fall ill, we treat their illnesses and care for them. We train them when they're raw. We bear them when they're mad, when they go crazy. We put them out to pasture when they're spent, all in kindness and compassion for them. But these are things masters do for their servants and owners of their property. You've heard his claims, said the king. Answer. The spokesman of the beasts replied. So this is the animal reply. The human argues that they buy and sell us. But as God himself said, these are but the days whose revolutions I bring about among men. None comprehends but the learned. So the animal is saying, well, sometimes humans enslave other cultures, other humans, but that doesn't mean that that's necessarily right or good. That humans have enslaved other humans in the past, that is still not, just because you can enslave a group of people doesn't mean that that's right or that God wants you to do that. As for, and this is the animals speaking, as for feeding and watering us, as he says, and everything else he says they do for us, these things are not done out of kindness or compassion, but for fear lest we die and they lose their investment in us and the benefits they take from us, drinking our milk, wearing our fleece or wool, riding on our backs, and having us carry their burdens. The ass spoke up and said, Your Majesty, had you seen us as prisoners of the sons of Adam, our backs laden with rocks, bricks, earth, wood, iron, and other heavy loads, struggling and straining to go forward, while they stood over us, stick in hand, to beat us brutally about the face and back in anger, you would have pitied us and shed tears of sorrow for us. Where then are there mercy and compassion? The ox said, Had you seen us, Your Majesty, as prisoners in the hands of the Adamites, yoked or bound to a water wheel or mill, with muzzles to our face and blinders on our eyes, as they beat us with sticks and clubs about the face and flanks, you would have pitied us and shed tears. Where then is your mercy? Where is the compassion that they speak of? And it just goes on and on. So each animal representative is talking about all the things that humans do that harm humans. And they're going to say, where is the holy in that? Where is the respect in that? So another passage that I think is really interesting is that humans say, well, humans are better than animals because we eat the richest foods, that animals have to eat things that are from the dirt, that are dirty. They can't cook. They can't prepare foods in the way that humans do. And humans wear beautiful clothing made of silk and wool, that we can create things that animals cannot create. This is what makes us superior. This is what the animals say in response to that. Your finest food, tastiest liquor, and best medicine is honey, the spittle of bees. It comes not from you, but from an insect. The milk, butter, cheese, whey, and other foods you boast of eating and drinking come not from you, but from animals. How can you brag that you are our betters? Our forefathers shared equally with yours in the days when we all lived in the Garden of the East. And so then he talks about more and more this idea that everything that humans enjoy in terms of culture come from animals, right? Your clothing comes from animals, that humans are naked, that they don't, their skin is not good to protect them from the elements, that humans have to take from animals in order to be warm and to protect themselves from the sun or the rain, so that we rely on what animals naturally have. We have to artificially produce or take from others. So again, what they're saying is that Allah has blessed them with many, many gifts, and that humans are not recognizing the gifts that were bestowed upon them by Allah. The last example that I want to mention is that humans say, look, we are superior and God favors us because God has spoken to us, but not animals. So God gave us the Quran and other holy texts. God has given humans the prophets. God has given us prophecies, and God does not speak to the animals. That the animals don't have holy texts, they don't have saints, they don't have prophets. So this is surely proof that we are favored by God, and because of that, we should be masters of animals. They also say humans have civilization. Humans have courts, judges, laws, politics. Animals do not have politics. They just live in brute nature. And this is another sign that humans are superior. The animals reply to all of this. You have your assembly rooms, halls, courtyards, and squares, but we revel in the broad expanse of open air, in lush meadows by the riverbank or seashore. We sail over gardens and treetops. We soar over mountains. We roam and alight where we like in God's ample land, eating of that which God gives us, without trouble or toil, drinking from rivers and pools without hindrance. We need no rope, no bucket or jug, no water skin like those you struggle with carrying water. We have no need to treat and purvey it, buy it or sell it, haggle over its price, exhausting the body, troubling the soul, grieving the heart, and wearying the spirit. All these are marks of miserable slaves. So what makes you so sure that you are the masters and we are the slaves? Then they address the prophecy. And they say, you must know, O humans, that God sent his prophets and messengers only to miscreant peoples and the ignorant masses who assign his divinity to others or deny his sovereignty, dispute his oneness, presume other gods, twist his laws, defy his commandments, shirk obedience, slight his bounty, fail to acknowledge him, and forget his covenant and trust. Humans stray and lead others astray, seducing good people from the straight path. But animals are clear of all these things. We submit to our Lord, acknowledge him, and humbly believe in him, proclaiming his oneness without doubt. So animals are saying you only need a prophet if you are sick and need to be healed. Animals are not sick, that in their everyday life, they give praise to God. You know, when a bird flies and spreads their wings, they are praising God by their form. And that's why they don't need prophets or holy books to tell them what to do, because every moment of their life, they're living a truly spiritual and good life. So those are some examples. Of course, we can disagree and argue, and I understand that. But what I think is really fascinating about this book and phenomenologically worthwhile is that this book was written by human beings, right? And it takes an enormous amount of humility, respect, and love for all of creation to question ourselves and think, well, it seems like we might be masters. It seems like these holy texts are telling us that we are supreme beings. What if we are wrong? What if the way we're interpreting the world is wrong? This is the foundation for all philosophy. What did Socrates do? Socrates said, he looked at ancient Greece and he looked at his society and he said, well, we think that we know what justice is, right? And so Socrates would go to the marketplace in Athens and he would see a judge walking down the street and he would say, hey, judge, you're a judge. What is justice? You must know, because that is your profession. And of course, as we know, when we read Plato, that Socrates would always end up confusing these experts and exposing that these experts are actually ignorant about what is really true. This is what philosophy is taking things that seem obviously true and undoubtable about our culture and our society and our ways of thinking about things. And it's about making the familiar strange. It's about humility. And I think that's really important when it comes to thinking about our communities. Are humans the only people that matter in the world? What do we lose when we don't, or we fail to see that the non-human matters? My last and final point before Q&A, I know I'm going a bit long, is to think about what do we do? So if I'm right, and you may not agree, of course, and that's okay. What do we actually do? Because here's the problem. Even if we're going to say that the non-human world matters just as much morally as the human world, we have to eat. So even if you don't eat meat, you have to eat plants. Plants are alive. Why is eating plants less bad than eating animals? We have to wear something. We have to clothe ourselves. We have to have houses and all sorts of things. So my problem is, as an APC person, is how do I morally kill other living creatures if I believe that those creatures are members of my community? If they're members, if they're actually partly of who I am, if animals and plants make up my own ontology, I'm hurting myself by hurting these creatures. How do I morally excuse that behavior? The problem is that I cannot lead a bloodless life. We all have to kill in order to live. That is a fact of life. How do we accept that if we want to include the non-human in our ethics and in our communities? What I propose is that civilized peoples, people like you and me, we need to be more like indigenous and tribal societies, and we need to create rituals of sacrifice. With very few exceptions, no civilization has forms of ritual sacrifice. The only exception that I know of, and I don't know everything, so please, if you have other examples, share them with me. The only exception to this is the bullfight of Spain. If you don't know what a bullfight is, it's this idea where you take a bull, a male bull, and you fight that bull in an arena in public, and you ritually kill that bull in front of an audience. And a lot of people, most people think that this is barbaric, that this is wrong, that it is torture, that it is disrespecting the animal. It's very complicated, but I think it actually is trying, even if it might fail ultimately, it is trying to make sacred the death of the animal in a way that no other act in any civilization does. So the way that most of us in civilizations kill animals and plants, we do it without thinking very seriously. We kill animals in slaughterhouses. We outsource that work. So most of us do not kill or harvest our own food. We go to the grocery store, or we're having other people do that for us. We're very divorced from that act. We also, when we kill or harvest plants, we don't give thanks. You might say a prayer before your meal, or you might adhere to halal or kosher rules, and that's good. But I think we have to do even more than that. So that's a good step. But I think we have to do even more than that. So in terms of sacred rituals of death, in pretty much every indigenous or tribal society around the world, indigenous communities create elaborate, time-consuming rituals when they kill another living creature. So if you want to know more about the specific ways in which that's done, this is a wonderful book. It's called Plants as Persons. I have a PDF of one of the chapters, and I'm happy to send that to anybody who's interested. And this book is all about how plants are a lot more conscious and aware than we think, that their lives are meaningful. And it gives lots of examples of the rituals of many Native American or Native Australian communities, and how they express their thanks through ritual and sacrifice. So one example is the Aborigines of Australia. So when they harvest the yam, for instance, they want to make sure that they don't over-harvest. So all indigenous communities try not to take more than what they need. That's the first step of making death sacred. We don't take more than what we need. And when they do harvest the yam, they cut off a piece of the yam and leave it in the earth, because they know that plants can regrow with certain parts of their bodies, that you can cut off a part of the body of a plant, but that plant itself can still live. So it's this mindful thing of, I'm taking the life of this particular plant, but I can replant and grow more yams as a kind of thanks, and to make sure that that life lives on, at least in some sense. There's another ritual in South American tribes, in Mexican tribes, where when you harvest a deer, when you kill a deer, this tribe will cut off the hooves of the deer that they kill, and they say prayers over the hooves, and they return the hooves of that deer to the family of that deer. So they go back into the forest and they place the hooves where they found that deer as a way to show humility and thanks. They're thanking the deer community for that sacrifice. And what's important in all of this is that when you create sacred rituals, you're acknowledging the enormous gift and sacrifice of animals and plants. You're saying, I recognize that when I kill a member of my community, this is an enormous loss. And we cannot kill ourselves as a way of thanks, right? So if I need to eat a cow, for instance, in order to live, I can't kill myself as a sacrifice to the cow to thank them, because the reason why I'm killing the cow is so that I can live. But what I can do is sacrifice my time. Time is life, right? So when I create an elaborate ritual of death, a ritual that I do not need to do in order to have that animal, what I'm doing is I'm giving up a part of my life as sacrifice in return to the death sacrifice that I receive. I'm acknowledging what I'm taking, and I'm trying to give at least a little bit back. These rituals that these indigenous communities enact are very time consuming, similar to like the bullfight. So in bullfighting, the matador is the person who kills the bull. It takes years and years of work to try to learn how to be good at bullfighting. I'm actually learning how to do it. I will never kill an actual bull because I'm a vegan, I don't eat animals, but I'm learning the movements, and it's really hard to do. You have to be very elegant. You have to know how to work the capes. They use these capes to move the bull where they want. There's a lot of time that goes in to learning to kill a bull in this ritual way, in the style of the bullfight. And you are giving up then your time, because I could kill a bull very easily. I could shoot a bull, right? I can put a bull in a slaughterhouse and just kill hundreds of them in a single day. But when we create rituals of sacrifice, what we're trying to do is acknowledge what we're doing. We're trying to give respect. We are taking our time that we don't have to do as an acknowledgement of what we're taking. I think that most civilized societies, we don't take rituals seriously. We don't have very many rituals. We do have many rituals religiously. So I know in Islam there is the ritual of sacrificing animals to God. That's a little bit different than praising the animal itself. So there's a difference between thanking God for his gifts, thanking God for food, and then thanking the animal, him or herself, and saying, I thank you, and I respect you, and I respect your community. So that's sort of what I'm sort of thinking about lately, is how can I make my life more sacred by creating or enacting rituals around my consumption of animals and plants. It's hard to do because civilization resists that. My culture doesn't make it very easy for me to live a sacred life with the non-human. I would argue that in America, I am not allowed to be sacred in my community with other humans. Liberalism destroys true community, in my opinion, and it makes it very hard for true community with anybody, humans included. But I think that's our task morally as civilized humans, is how can we better respect the non-human world by enacting rituals and making our lives more sacred than they currently are. In conclusion, I think one thing that a lot of people experience when they hear these kinds of ideas is, that's all well and good, Danielle, but I will never feel as strongly about animals or plants as I do about a human, that I will never care as much about animals or plants as I do my fellow human. The good news is that you don't have to. So I don't have to feel emotionally as connected to animals or plants as I do my fellow humans. All creatures are perspectival. We are subjective, and we engage in the world subjectively, meaning we don't even care about all humans equally. You care about your friends and your family more than you care about me because you don't know me. That doesn't mean, however, that you necessarily assume that I morally am worth less than your loved ones. It just means that you don't know me. I'm not really a member of your community. And so you're not going to care as much about what happens to me. That's completely normal, and there's nothing wrong with that. So as humans, we can experience caring about the death of humans more than the death of animals and plants. That's fine. You don't have to care about everyone equally to live a sacred and good life. All that I'm asking is for us to think more deeply about what can we do to be more moral in our communities. How can we include as many people as possible into our moral life world? Who are we leaving out? I would argue that we are greatly diminished as human beings ontologically when we ignore the non-human in our ontology, in our ethics, in our politics, that we become less human in a sense by negating their influence on who we are in our communities, that we only gain wonderful things when we open up our moral life world to others. The only thing that we lose, and I think this is what many of us are afraid of losing, is our supremacy. But we never deserved that in the first place. We do not deserve having more power morally or politically over others, not only over other humans, but other life forms as well. So we only give up the things that we never deserved in the first place, and what we gain is true morality, true community, and I would say true flourishing for everybody. Thank you very much. Questions? Sorry I was long.
Thank you, Danielle. You hear me?
I can hear you, Hamid.
There always have been questions about how we can apply phenomenology in our concrete life. By having you and Peter online, we learned how we can use phenomenology to use and to approach our concrete life. And we learned a lot about you and your attitudes. Thank you. I'll just say something in Farsi to my attendees. خب دوستان خیلی ممنون که تا اینجا موندید، گوش دادید. خیلی ممنون که میکروفوناتون رو و ویدیوهاتون رو روشن نکردید و همراه ما بودید. اگر دوستان سوالی دارن که علاقه‌مند هستن که خودشون به انگلیسی بپرسن، برای ما بنویسن. اگر دوستان میخوان که سوالشون رو به فارسی بنویسن، ترجمه اون به انگلیسی ما برای پروفسور میر بگیم، هم بهمون بگن. تو این فاصله میتونیم منتظر بمونیم تا دوستان نظرشون بگن. Danielle, would you please just show the book Animal vs. Human again so I can download it?
Can you see that?
It is the case of the animals versus man. Okay. Mahmoud.
Can I ask my question?
Mahmoud, is it you?
Can you hear me, Professor?
I can hear you, but
it's a little low.
Yeah.
Okay, I speak a little loud. Okay, I have many questions thanks to your great presentation, and but due to the limitations, I only going to ask one or maybe two of them. First of all, I begin with your last subject about the sacrifice rituals. Of course, I think sacrifice rituals in the indigenous communities shows some sort of appreciation to non-human beings.
Mahmoud.
Sorry.
Just we need you to improve your voice.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, sorry.
Yes, but not so sharp.
I don't know. Maybe it's better that I just type it. Yeah.
Can you just change your device, or I don't know, something like this?
Okay, can you hear me now?
It's better.
Sorry.
Sorry
for that problem. Okay. Of course, I think sacrifice rituals in indigenous communities shows some sort of appreciation to non-human beings. But how can it explain the moral justification to kill them? Shouldn't we think about a moral base for this action philosophically?
Yes.
And another question, if I may ask, if we cannot evaluate beings based on their actions, characteristics, or etc., how can we make sure helping the life flourish? Don't we need any criteria, standard, or even a base for judgment? And of course, that needs to define what is good or bad for that purpose. Flourishing the life. Thank you very much.
Wonderful questions. Thank you for giving me a chance to explain more in detail. For your last question, I'll address first. Of course, we need to be able to judge actions. So when I was talking about, the moral life of a tree versus my action, I was only talking about their moral status. Should we care about trees, in the same way that we might care about humans? It does not mean that we should not judge what individuals do in the world. So as the introduction mentioned, I teach at a prison. And these men, if they're not innocent, many of them actually, unfortunately, are innocent. But many of them are not. They were convicted of the crimes fairly. I would judge those actions as bad. And I think that was not right, those things that they did. However, those actions do not affect my estimation of who they are as beings deserving of kindness and compassion. Those people are still members of my community, and they still deserve moral consideration. However, again, of course, I can condemn those specific actions that they have done, and we would have to, as a community, work out any wrongdoing. So, of course, APC has rules to live by morally. There are things that are good for us and things that are bad. How we do that is through flourishing, as you mentioned. If I'm acting in a way that suppresses the flourishing of others, I am morally responsible for that, and I need to correct myself. That would be considered morally wrong. But even as I'm acting immorally, I don't think that it erases my worth, if that makes sense. I don't cease to become someone who's worthy of being in a community, if that makes sense. So that's the distinction. Of course, we need to judge wrongdoing and make sure that wrongdoing doesn't happen often, but everyone, regardless of what they do, I think is worthy of being considered a part of our communities, if that makes sense. The other thing that you mentioned is, how do Indigenous people excuse their killing? Well, this book is really great because it talks about this. So the interesting thing about most Indigenous communities is that they see themselves as kinships. They're kin to the non-human. So a lot of their religious and spiritual stories revolve around the fact that, like, the yam is really important to Australian Aborigines, the yam plant. And they believe that their human ancestors married yams. They actually believe that the first human was a yam, was a plant. That doesn't make sense to us, I think, as civilized people, because our religion is very human-centered. But in Indigenous tribes, their religion, their spirituality is inclusive of the animal and plant world, such that animals and plants are also, they have spirits. So they believe that kinship ties allow them to kill. So in many of these stories, they will say, the yam offered itself to me. I had a vision, and the yam said, I will sacrifice myself to you because you are my daughter, you are my son. So that's how they conceptualize that. Now, you and I may not believe in that. So how would we think about the morality? The only thing that I can say as a secular person from a non-religious perspective is that we have to kill, that there's no way out of that. Either we kill or we just kill ourselves. So at a very fundamental level, killing is something that we have to do. We don't really have that much of a choice. Where ethics comes into play here is how do we kill, whom do we kill, when do we kill, and how often. Those are things that we have control over, and those are the things that we need to think about to become moral persons. We don't have to kill nearly as much or in the damaging ways that we do in most civilizations. We need to fix that. But it is true that we're going to have to kill at least some of the time. And I don't know, on some level we just have to accept that. It's hard to accept, but it seems to be a fact of life that has to happen on some level. So the moral imperative for me is just to try to reduce suffering as much as possible. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. You've been asked that how you, after just saying, let me just read it.
Yeah.
Amazing, inspiring ideas in our super individualistic, hierarchical societies, and at the time of the pandemic when human death is so cheap, could you please elaborate on how you define violence in your thesis?
Oh my goodness. How do I define violence phenomenologically? I'm very interested in this question because I'm interested in criminality. I think that we tend to think of violence as a thing. And I don't think violence is a thing. It's a way of being in the world. It is a way of being in relationship to ourselves and to our communities. And so violence to me is, to put it in the most simple terms, is whenever we are suppressing the shared good, whenever we act in ways that prevent members of our communities from flourishing, that is bad. And that's an act of violence. So when I'm suppressing the publicity of the shared good, just like liberals do, like when liberals say the good is not shared, the good is individual, I'm only going to care about me. That's what capitalism is. Capitalism is a form of violence. It is one of the worst acts of violence that any civilization does, I think, because capitalism is about competition. It's about me saying, I'm only going to look out for myself, and I don't care about anybody else. I'm going to look out for number one. And capitalism also says, and this is what liberalism I think itself does, is say that I will only take care of you if it benefits me in some way. It's not because I really care about you. So when I get a cheap price in capitalism for a particular good, right, I get this book for really cheap on Amazon. It's not because Amazon cares about me, right, that it's giving this cheap price to me. It's because ultimately that benefits Amazon. That benefits that organization. But Amazon doesn't care. Amazon wants to use me. Amazon is like a vampire. It wants to suck my blood. It wants to take my money from me and to use me for its own benefit. So to me, again, violence is any process or activity that suppresses the shared good and prevents people from flourishing as much as they could. Now, killing is an act of violence, right? In the sense of I'm destroying the possibility of the good for that animal or plant, because if I kill you, you cease to be. You have no good anymore. But I think that there are different kinds of violence. There's a kind of necessary violence in death, and I have to bear that burden. So when I kill a plant or an animal, even if I try to do it in a moral way, there is always violence there. There's always blood on my hands. Even if I kill a plant, there's blood on my hands morally. There's no way around that, and I just have to bear that guilt and that shame. But think about Aristotle. Aristotle said that something is moral, or you are responsible for your morality and your actions if you can help it. A lion is not morally responsible for killing a gazelle because the lion has to kill the gazelle. The lion doesn't really have a choice. The same is true for humans, not in every single sense, but the same is true. I have to kill something in order to live. And so on that level, I don't really have a choice. Therefore, to say I'm a bad person because of that, I think is perhaps not accurate. the morality comes into play when I kill more than I need to, when I kill unnecessarily, when I create more suffering than I could have avoided, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, violence is always with us because we always have to kill, but we can minimize violence, and there are different ways phenomenologically to understand different kinds of violence. And then the moral category of those violences differ in the context. So context is very important to all of phenomenology in terms of ethics. We have to understand the context in which the violence takes place and whether or not I have true control over avoiding that violence or not, if that makes sense. Oh.
They have just said something about the, let me just read it, huh? The view provided by religions such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, I think, is the promotion of hierarchical worldview, which has been the mainstream and dominant view for majority of history we know. So the moral code proposed by religious does show characteristic of that. What do you think?
I agree. So I think that all civilized religions are not as good as indigenous spiritualities because there is this hierarchy that's embedded in the Abrahamic traditions. It is very clear in the holy texts of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, that there is a hierarchy to being, right? The jinn, for instance, are considered better than humans, right? Angels are considered better than humans or animals. So there is this hierarchy. I am not religious in that sense, so I do critique those religions. However, because I want my way of thinking to be accepted by as many people as possible, I think that even if you are Muslim, Jewish, or Christian, that you can still agree with a lot of what I'm saying in terms of how you act in the world. So in Abrahamic religions, there is the idea and concept of stewardship. That even if you want to disagree with me, and if you say, look, my holy texts tell me that humans are better than animals or plants, you still have to be a good steward, meaning God gave humans not the power to do whatever they want, but the power to be stewards over the earth, to sort of look after the earth for God. So even if you are religious and you do believe in a hierarchy, which I don't personally advocate or believe, and APC does not advocate, but I understand that people have different spiritualities than I do, is that you still have to be a good steward. So if we think about in the Catholic tradition, St. Francis is the patron saint of animals and plants. And he's always talking about how it's important to respect God's creation. So again, even if we think that hierarchy exists, there are still ways to look after plants and animals that I would agree with. Now, if the question is asked by someone who also critiques, like if the person who asked that question is also is critiquing hierarchy, then I would just say I agree with that. That I think that the way that we've traditionally approached Abrahamic religions has been very damaging, not only to the non-human world, but to other humans. But I do think that these religions can be rehabilitated. If we, just like this book says, if we reinterpret the holy texts differently than what we currently have been doing, we will treat the non-human world better. So even though I personally am an atheist, I am open to religion. I think that religion can be reformed and we can think differently within our religious beliefs. But if you're asking me personally, I'm more on the side of indigenous and tribal ways of thinking about spirituality. Yeah.
Okay. Regarding the James Fowler's understanding of the act of fate, can we just regarding the previous question, can we say that there is no essence in Abrahamic religions? We are being religious, which are historic beings, and there can be a kind of a religious life by which you can avoid that hierarchy or tradition phenomenologically.
Yes. yes, I think that we can reinterpret the text. The text is open, right? So there's not just one way to be Christian or Muslim or Hindu or anything. That we can. That's what hermeneutics is all about, right? Is seeing religion as a living process. It's not set in stone. And that's why so many outsiders, the Quran or the Bible, because they say, look, it says contradictory things. That's not necessarily a problem, right? Because it's just saying, of course there's things that are contradictory, because what made sense in that particular time, place, history, and context may no longer make sense now. So I agree that, yes, we can change and we can still be religious if we choose to be, and do things differently than our ancestors did or our parents did. That's my personal belief. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to make clear this point that the Abrahamic religions are not essentially hierarchical, you know.
I think historically they are, but I think I agree with you that maybe perhaps ontologically we can change that. Yes.
So, thank you for your time, Professor. You know, for those who are not living outside Iran, I just downloaded the full version of your books. I mean, the books you introduced and
wonderful.
shared with others. So I don't think that if you use them, they can tell you why or ask you or question you or
Of
something.
course, absolutely.
So
Yeah.
I've just sent it to the group. You can download it too. Thank you everyone for being with us. If there is no questions, we can just thank you, say bye to you, and
All right.
wish best for you and Peter.
Thank you very much, everybody, for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.